Hey everybody, this is Razib, and I am here with I think episode 40th episode of the conversation. There's been a lot of stuff going on in the world. Right now, I guess the first thing we want to talk about is uh, Donald Trump. I don't know, Democratic Socialist. Uh, libtard. I don't know. So he announced. I mean, it's not enacted as policy. I don't know how he's going to do this. Like just by fiat, gonna cap like prescription drug prices, which is it's a big left wing progressive priority. I've heard it from Bernie Sanders and other people, and it's super popular uh, because prescription drugs cost a lot of money for American seniors and stuff like that. For a lot of people, they cost a lot of money, but um, the simple, like, potted, like, libertarian slash, like, economic argument for why you shouldn't cap the prices is that it's like rent control. When you cap the price of something, uh, you know, well, the incentive to actually do the thing disappears. And so there are a lot of people who are angry and they think that this is like a major hit to drug development in the United States. Uh, and partly, the traditional argument has been that first of all, some people have argued our prescription prices are actually not that high. Like 91% of people use generics, but
Mhm.
um, in the U.S. But the other issue is, the high prices that we have on some drugs is what allows the drugs to be developed and released, and then eventually generics will make them cheap, and so in a way we are subsidizing the whole world having cheap generics and access to drugs and stuff like that.
Right.
Uh, yeah, and so I mean that's the argument. Um, and like some people are pissed, some people are not pissed. It seems like people who are kind of pro tariff are starting to get like a little annoyed by this because this is like I mean this is a Bernie Sanders policy straight up, right?
I think Bernie likes tariffs too.
Yeah,
I'm
he
not
does.
sure.
I think he does as
Sure.
well. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I was thinking about it. It's it's complicated. One thing when I heard about this policy, one thing that makes it complicated is you can never tell anymore what the actual policy goal is, right? So I knew as soon as I heard about this, and I thought, well, what are people going to say in defense of this policy? And I correctly anticipated what even may be true, which is that, okay, this is just an opening bid, right? This is a start of negotiation. Trump does this. Other countries, and the drug companies are going to respond, and you work out some deal at some point, down the line. And there could be something to that, as we know, as we've seen with the tariffs, what the headline numbers are today are not necessarily the headline numbers for tomorrow. It does seem like, I mean, my impression, as you said, Razib, is that to a significant extent, it seems like the rest of the world has been free riding off of America for drug development. I don't know if it's every other country in the world, but it seems like at least every other major market has these sorts of price controls for prescription drugs in place through their national health system or through some other sort of deal. A lot of countries, they just cheat and make the drugs without the proper payments or authorizations or stuff like that, particularly in some third world countries I'm thinking of. And these drugs are pretty expensive to develop, right? So where, if you're going to put a lot of money into developing a drug, where do you expect the payoff? And it's sort of been, well, you can get the payoff from the US market, and the US market is big enough that that provides a pretty hefty incentive, and it doesn't matter quite as much if the rest of the world is kind of screwing you with price controls or whatever, right? But if you take away that last free rider, then that's no longer true. And so there's just not the same incentive to develop new drugs, right? Okay, so that if that's the if that's the final equilibrium, that would be pretty bad. I would have to say, like, because for all the complaints about big pharma and so forth, I do think that there's a lot of benefit to be had from a lot of these drugs, right? Not only now, but in the future. Um, Trump himself, I saw just a little bit of his news conference, and well, I don't know if this is the only specific drug that he highlighted, but he did highlight Ozempic, right? And he called it the fat shot drug, the fat shot drug. So that's the new name. And it's still early going, but it seems like there may be really huge benefits from Ozempic. Not only it's an obesity drug, and of course, obesity is a huge health problem in the U.S., although also other developed countries. Major burden on medical systems, yada yada yada, which Ozempic could potentially alleviate. It also appears that Ozempic has all sorts of other side benefits, which are not entirely understood. Health benefits, people drink less, smoke less, gamble less. You know, other health problems tend to kind of resolve itself. So I'm, at the same time, there's also people talk about long-term effects, but so on and so forth, right? It's not just about Ozempic, but point is, this is a drug that seems to have huge benefits. It's very expensive right now, and going forward, I mean, the typical trajectory. It's not only for drugs, but for most innovations is you start out, it's very expensive, only rich people can afford it. Then it becomes less expensive over time, and eventually it becomes really cheap and everybody can afford it, right? And you see that with cars, you see that with computers, you see that with drugs. With drugs, it's even more scheduled because, as you say, eventually you can start buying generics, other things like that. So that's a system that works, and you don't necessarily want to muck with that. At the same time, it would be, I think, fairer if you could work out a system where the costs of that are not just borne by the United States. If other countries were, if we were able to work out some agreement where, okay, other countries pay a little bit more for their drugs and Americans can pay less. And so overall the incentive is not altered, but it's more fair, equitably distributed. I mean, if Trump works that out, then, God bless him. I, I have my questions about whether that's going to be what we end up with, but the equilibrium, I just don't. I guess what I say is, if the stable equilibrium is just we have price controls like everybody else, and that seems bad. But I don't know if that's a stable equilibrium. We'll have to see. Like, maybe if even in the absence of a negotiation, if other countries aren't able to free ride off the United States, maybe they'll just be like, I guess we kind of gotta do better by the drug companies, otherwise we'll be screwed too. So I don't. It's hard to say. We don't. I don't even know what the end policy goal is, and will we get there, and will it be better than what we had now? It's very complicated business.
Yeah, I would say it is complicated. Part of it is uncertainty and volatility, right? Uh, Molson, my friend Molson Hart, who lives here in Austin, but he's become a kind of a big deal as businessman on social media. Went on Tucker Carlson, but I know Molson back in the day. He was on my podcast very early on, and he was saying he has like all these long tweet threads about the China tariffs, and he
Yeah.
has stuff in Vietnam. I think the main thing that he's though is the volatility is toxic for businesses that are try to plan. But the volatility is also part of the plan, in terms of like kind of being unpredictable and trying to strike a deal. I do think yeah, Trump loves to strike deals, which is fair enough. The problem though is like it just seems like you know you should focus on some big deals here and there, not do like have like hundreds of plays out there. Like all the like a bilateral trade deal with every country in the world or something is ridiculous. It's not scalable. A bilateral trade deal with like the top 20 countries is like that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
Like I think we got one with England. Whatever. Like as we're recording, uh, the tariffs like were dropped on China. And a lot of people are like, wait, what the? And some of the arguments that we've had, with some of our friends, it was like, we're straight up, like, I'm straight up, like I'm okay with like really high tariffs on China. What I'm like not okay with is just like tariffs on every random country in the world,
Right.
And
Right.
now we're in a situation we have like where China is not at disadvantage at all. So now I want to know like all these people that are arguing like you don't understand Trump's genius. Like, okay, well, what's going on with China now?
Yeah.
Like these are the
Right.
tariffs that everyone agreed on, and
Right.
now it's just like China's not at a comparative disadvantage anymore. Was it the whole goal that China was going to be at the comparative disadvantage? I don't know. So just like I don't want to talk too much about tariffs. I guess like the tariffs just like suck me in, but the point here is if Trump really does believe in this sort of thing, Ro Khanna is proposing like he should like support legislation, and I'm pretty skeptical of these of this project, but that is a good point. Like if you really want to make a change to the current equilibrium, bring the legislative branch in on this. There's definitely a left Trump alignment here. Uh, I mean, MAGA will go along with this. MAGA will go along with pretty much anything. But the reality is, like, people on the right, Republicans, they have always opposed this sort of thing, So it's not like it's a deep seated support for this policy. In contrast, Bernie Sanders and the Democrats have been talking about this. I mean, I think like for decades now, haven't they? Like the Democratic presidents have always kind of balked at doing anything, but during primaries, they kind of like give some like lip service to it. It's very popular as a popular. Well, it's a populist policy. It's very popular for people want cheaper when they hear about like super expensive drugs for these people. It's really bad. But the reality is drugs are, prescription drugs are pretty cheap, actually. The average median prescription drug is pretty cheap.
Mhm.
But the reality is that's kind of like priced in or it's like discounted. It's kind of like baked into people's assumption that you should be able to get, the normal prescription drugs pretty cheaply. And we don't think about how miraculous that is.
Yeah.
The problem is, oh, that experimental cancer drugs, which is like
Right.
$500,000, and now it's up to insurance whether insurance will pay for it or not. People think it's very unfair, and so it's just a much easier argument to make. And this is the classic kind of fusionist conservative complaint that you know you don't see the benefits of a lot of things that libertarian conservatives want, in terms of the economic. Like people don't feel the benefits; they take it for granted. Whereas the pains, the harms, like the trade-offs, they feel those. And this is the same argument for trade, but I think it's for medicine and drugs is extreme in terms of like oh like this $1 million drug could save someone from blindness, and the insurance companies aren't approving it. But the reality is they can't approve everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think I'm not an expert in this area by any means, but I am a kind of intellectual dilettante. And it does seem like there may be a lot of potential in the process at FDA for improvements. One of the reasons why drug development is so expensive is because of all the FDA requirements in terms of testing and other stuff. That can be hugely expensive and time consuming. And I don't know that all of that gives you a lot of value add in terms of safety or efficacy of these drugs. Possible that you could have some sort of reforms at FDA that would speed up the time for drug development, would reduce the cost of drug development without, with a huge net benefit for public health. That doesn't, I don't think that's where RFK's head is at, but it's possible. Another issue is, in social science, they talk about the replication crisis, and there are all sorts of scientific findings that don't replicate. That's also true in medicine and with drug development. There are some problems in terms of it doesn't seem like we're getting the best bang for our buck. Our hit rate, I guess I would say our hit rate in terms of finding good new drugs is not where it should be, I think, right? And so that's another big thing where if you could solve that, that's basically a huge free lunch. Where if you could solve that, you could it wouldn't make the cost of so part of the issue with drug development is it's not just the cost of the drug itself that you have to deal with, it's the cost of all the other drugs that didn't pan out, right? Because the companies have to recoup that too. So if you could increase the hit rate, even if you don't um, decrease the cost in order to develop a particular drug, the benefits are going to go up and the costs will go down because there'll be less wasted money on drugs that just don't pan out or whatever. These are not easy problems to solve, certainly, but that seems to me to be where the billion-dollar bills on the sidewalk are, not forcing drug prices down by fiat. So again,
Yeah.
I don't know that this is where these don't seem to be the priorities of RFK or of Casey Means, who I guess is going to be the Surgeon General, maybe. I'm actually a little confused because there's Casey Means and then there's
Callie.
Callie Means, who is her brother, maybe.
Yeah, it's her brother.
Yeah, I only recently found out that they were two different people. In fact, I was confused because sometimes I would see a picture of a man, sometimes a picture of a woman, and it's like, well, wait, which one? And anyway, that's not so important. But I know Jim O'Neill, who is supposed to be deputy HHS secretary. I think his thinking is more in line with this. So perhaps he's not confirmed yet. Maybe when he comes on, he can pursue some of those types of issues as well. There's nothing, as far as I can tell, there's nothing in what I've suggested that is contrary to, you know, Trump mindset. I don't think he would necessarily have a problem with anything I've said. And at least to a certain extent, RFK either. It doesn't seem like that's what he's thinking about, but I don't know that if you told him, hey, we need to get the costs of, we need to get the drug development process reformed, that he would say, oh, that's horrible. We can't do that. Maybe. But so these are things that are out there. I don't know if they'll be worked on or not, but I hope they will be.
Yeah, I guess one thing that I would say is that's all true. But the main issue with I think some of these policies is, Trump is a politician. He's probably not going to run again, but he likes to go for things that are popular and they're easy to sell to the public. And capping the price on prescription drugs, easy to sell to the public. Reforming the regulatory regime uh,
Right.
so that drugs can come onto the market quicker and it's cheaper. Uh, is not easy to sell to the public. Like they might agree with it, but it's not something they would vote for. It's not something that would be motivating. It's not something that like sticks in their craw or like you know is associated strongly uh, with a candidate who proposes that, right? So I think what we're seeing here is Trump is pretty good actually at with exceptions. I mean, like the tariff stuff isn't super popular, but when it comes to like populist stuff, he's just all over the place in terms of what he will kind of glom onto. Like for example, we talked about this on the abortion issue. Trump is basically, I think he's threaded the needle like to the median. Like he has like a pretty popular position, which is leave it to the states and basically don't have the feds do anything about it. You know, and I think that that's actually like a whatever a min-max strategy. That's a pretty good strategy actually. Where I like with the drugs again, this is something that there's been a lot of populist pressure, but the fact that the Senate and the Congress and I mean, the fact that they raise from elites, they tend to come from elites. Elites like understand a little bit more of the downside. We did price control in the 1970s. It's not like it
Right.
wasn't try.
Right.
In I mean, the communists had price controls, obviously, because the government set the prices, right?
Yeah.
So what price controls do is basically they interfere in the market process, which is something that in capitalist economies people tend not to want to mess with, but it's popular. Just like interest is not popular. Interest on loans is not popular. Interest on credit cards is not popular. But you have to have those. Like for example, Trump is. I think he said he favors this, and this is some originally another left wing plank, capping interest rates on credit cards at 10%.
Right.
Okay, what that's going to do is make it so credit cards are only given to upper middle class and upper class people,
Yeah.
which maybe that's okay. Maybe that's what
Yeah.
you want to do.
I'd say I have kind of ambivalent
Yeah,
feelings about the credit card thing because I totally accept the counter argument that hey, if you cap credit card interest rates at 10%, then that's just going to make it harder for people to get credit. A lot of people will not be able to with people with bad credit will not be able to get credit cards, for example. And I think that's true, although it is the case. I saw a congressional hearing recently where they had Visa and MasterCard there, and they were asked what their profit margin was. And for both companies, it was over 50%, and I actually went and checked to see, was that just kind of like a rare? And it seems like no, at least in recent years, they have consistently had profit margins in the range of 40, 50, 60%, which is a lot of businesses, your profit margin is 3%. So there's some fat to trim, potentially. They could absorb a little bit. But the broader thing is, I think I agree. I totally agree. It would restrict credit for some people, but I increasingly feel that there are some people, it's not everybody, but there seem to be a sizable fraction of the population who is just, they are like alcoholics for credit. They are just, they're not able to comprehend it. And one thing that you see, this is not a credit card thing per se, but even in student loans, one thing that you see on X periodically is someone will say, I got these student loans. I've been making payments on the student loans for 10 years or something. And my principal is now higher than when it started. So it's a scam. Okay, well, obviously, if you pay less per month than the accrued interest in that month, you're never going to pay off the principal. That's true. That's true of any type of debt, whether it's credit card debt, whether it's student loan, and I, it is kind of shocking when it comes to some of these loans. This is another thing that I saw on X. Someone had a chart that showed student loan repayment. I think it was from people who got their loans in 2009, 2008, 2009, something like that. And so it's been like 15 years. And for men as a group, they have repaid about 30% of the principal on their loans, right? And for women as a group, they've basically repaid none of the principal. I think it's maybe like they've repaid 3% or 5%, something like that. But it's basically nothing after 10, 15 years. And I don't know. I mean, if people are, I don't think that's a sign that something has seriously gone wrong. People don't seem to understand, the basics of like how loans are supposed to work and like repayment or whatever. To me, that's a sign that credit is maybe too loose. It's maybe too easy. People are giving out these loans too easy, and they're never, I don't think that's ultimately sustainable. So I'm a little sympathetic to the credit card thing for that reason. I'm not saying that 10% interest rate cap is a good idea. I'm sure there's all sorts of other factors, but it does make me wonder, maybe a little bit. I mean, I have some strong libertarian sympathies, but maybe a little bit of paternalism, so people just don't get into debt slavery for the rest of their lives, would be good.
Well, like, on student loans, I think the simplest thing um, uh, is make the loans dischargeable. That'll immediately mean that the servicers or the companies will not
Right.
they will not just like automatically lend to anybody because right now they
Right.
can't go. It is like not dischargeable in bankruptcy. Once you put some skin in the game, they will automatically react to the market. Um, I think something similar to the student loans, I do have to say, is online gambling. Online gambling does seem to be destroying the lives of many
Yeah.
20-something men, and I don't know what we're gonna do about it, but it seems like pretty straightforward. This is an addiction, and it's just like, it's just a transfer of money from one person to another person with like
Right.
there's no like productivity here, you know? It's not like
Yeah.
adding liquidity. Like it's even worse than say a pawn shop. It's not adding liquidity into the system. It's not like helping people out. It's just like they're addicted. They're addicted to the dopamine rush, and it's like associated with money, you know? So in terms of money coming out of your system, and also the online gambling companies, they're pretty evil insofar as like, they can manipulate things so you keep losing in a way that when you go to the casino, it's not as easy, you know?
Well, yeah.
Like
I mean,
they can't
casinos.
like they can't change the rules in the middle of,
I'm
I,
not super familiar with the online betting rules. So I don't know about that.
yeah,
I do know.
I'm not either. I've heard though that like
Yeah.
they're really optimized to make you lose money, and they're
Okay.
really good at it. They're really good at it because
Yeah.
they know exactly because they have like really good tracking on all the different players and on you, and you know what I'm saying?
Yes. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I did know from Nate Silver that if you win too much money, they will just stop accepting your bets, which is
Yeah,
true. I think of pretty much all. I mean, it's true of
yeah.
casinos.
Like, basically, if you're good at it, they will not work with you,
Right.
you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. So that's.
So,
I mean, that's a standard, and I do, without knowing the specifics, I am concerned in general with big data and technology, AI, all this, advertising, all this other stuff. In the past, if you had someone who was predisposed towards losing a bunch of money gambling or whatever, there was a lot of friction in the system. So they were at risk, but it was harder for companies or whoever to kind of seek them out, And now, as you say, it does seem like we've kind of designed a system where they can aggressively seek people out and encourage destructive behavior. And this is something that I worry about in general, as if as as AI becomes more powerful and other things, more and more, a greater and greater percentage of the population is going to be vulnerable to something, whether it's uh, algorithms, whether it's designer drugs, whatever, um, so that, I mean, that's a huge problem, and I don't exactly know what to do about it. It's actually So the new pope is concerned about. He said,
Yeah,
um,
yeah. Well, who is so like switching gears. We got an American Pope. That's pretty
"Yes,
weird.
USA, USA,
That's pretty
USA."
weird. Because like I always imagine Pope with like if he tries to speak English with a really strong accent, and then like
Right.
this guy's from Chicago.
Yes.
It's pretty weird. So yeah, tell us about this guy. Are you feeling good? Or you feel bad as a harsh right wing? No, just
Yeah. Right. 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 So I will say I never thought that I would see an American pope. It didn't even occur to me that it was a realistic possibility, even though, America is a big country. There's a lot of Catholics here. It's also a very rich country. It's politically important on the world stage. But partly for those very reasons, the conventional wisdom was always that the cardinals, who were overwhelmingly not American, would not want to elect an American pope. You know, uh, so that was a surprise. And then even during the conclave period, during the interregnum period, there were lots of articles about different possible replacements. Who is going to win the election. And I probably read up on 12, 15 different possible new popes. And Prevost was not among them, so he was not. I think if you look at the betting markets, I'm not sure, but on Polymarket, he definitely was not considered in the running. I don't even know if they had a market for him. They might have had an individual market for him, but I'm not even sure of that. They had a bunch of different names that you could bet on for who it's going to be, and I'm not sure if his was even one of them. There was, there. I think if you go back and look at the media attention, there was some people did talk about him, so it's not like he was totally unknown, but he was definitely not considered like a top rank contender. So that's kind of a surprise. It's always hard to try and figure out what the Cardinals were thinking in terms of like why did they settle on this guy? Um, Maybe it doesn't even matter, because their role is done, and for whatever reason, he's elected. But it's possible. Yeah, I've heard all sorts of different possible theories. He seems to be. I mean, he seems to be an interesting guy. He seems to be a good guy. I He picked the name Leo the 14th, which I really like. I have a fondness for some of the other Leos as Pope. Leo the Great, of course, who saved Rome from Attila the Hun, and Leo the 13th famously condemned socialism and had some nice things to say about America. So that's good. He very early days, but he seems to be kind of a return to normalcy from the Francis era, which was kind of erratic and you never knew what was going to happen. And Francis, I think, like he said, his motto was like "make a mess," right? Which, you know, you want to treat that positively or negatively. There's sort of an element of that. So probably, I suspect that, and this is, I think, maybe kind of a more general trend is just like a less frenetic, all consuming, just not as much attention, right? Not as much attention, which is probably what the church needs. We do not have the same influence that we used to. People don't really care what the Pope says in the way that they did 100 or 50 or even 20 years ago, really. I mean, Pope Leo, like he said, the reason, one of the reasons why he picked the name Leo is because he thought we were on the cusp of like a new industrial revolution with AI and other stuff. And so he thought it was important to try have the church respond to those issues, which, I'll be interested to see what he has to say about that. But probably, the titans of Silicon Valley are not going to be looking to the Pope for guidance on that stuff, I would have to say, even Peter Thiel, who is interested in these sorts of uh, issues, maybe he would be interested, but probably not. This is just like the center of gravity of intellectual life and influence has moved away from the church. And I think the moral authority has been damaged, by sex abuse stuff, other stuff like that. Um, so maybe a like more traditional, little bit more boring papacy is what is called for.
Well, okay, so one thing that I want to say is the first American pope. He's also the first black pope.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, at least that we know of. You know,
Well, I mean,
there.
talk about his black heritage, I guess, like because some people are saying it's not true, and some people are saying it's true. I mean, he
Well,
looks
it
like an
does seem
Italian. He looks like an Italian guy to me, but
he does. Yeah, yeah. I mean, he looks Italian. I guess his family is from. So he grew up in Chicago, but his grandparents are a couple generations back were from New Orleans, from Louisiana, and race in Louisiana has always been a little bit different than race in the rest of the United States. In the rest of the United States, historically followed basically, I mean, they called it the one drop rule. It wasn't exactly the one drop rule in practice. No one had DNA tests back then or anything. But for most of the United States, it's basically if you had any black ancestry, you're considered black, right? So, if you had one black great grandparent, then you're black. Okay. But Louisiana, they tended to follow the customs that you get in, Latin America, South America, other, parts where it's more fluid, so you would be like Creole, Creole basically means you have some African ancestry, but I think you're like majority European or something like that, right? That was like its own distinct thing, and this is, I think, in other parts of the world, not that uncommon. I know even in South Africa, where they had apartheid, they were very concerned about racial issues, but they did have, there was a white category and a black category, and then there's also a colored category for people who were kind of mixed race, and they actually formed their own community and, it's their own thing. So this is not, so this is, I think, a fairly common way of looking at things in other parts of the world, but it's not so common in the US except for in Louisiana, right? So that seems to be the environment where his family came out of, where they were Creole, they were mixed race or whatever. And then I guess when his parents moved up to Chicago, they're basically, uh, you know, they're obviously mostly European of ancestry. And so they're just like, well, we'll just consider ourselves white or whatever. So I don't know that it plays a huge role in like his identity or so on and so forth, but it's an interesting tidbit. I mean, it's in a way, if you're thinking about like a Pope of America, having a Pope who is kind of a mix of all sorts of different cultures and ethnicities, not cultures and ethnicities, racial groups, ethnic groups, whatever, however you want to say that. Maybe that's good. That's a kind of reflective of us, right? Because we are kind of even um, a mix of all sorts of different white ethnic groups, and then African groups and Hispanic groups and so on and so forth. It's very rare to find someone in the US who is purely anything. You know, I knew a guy from Rhode Island who his claim to fame was he was like 100% French Canadian, you know, right? And so he was like very proud that he was 100% French Canadian or whatever. But normally you get someone that's like, well, I'm Irish and then also Italian. And then of course I got a little bit of, you know, German or Nordic or Greek or something. And then maybe you get a little bit of Cherokee or, some black ancestry in there or it's all sorts of stuff, right? So he's reflective of kind of America in that sense.
I'll tell you a funny story is in other parts of the world it's not like that. So I had exchange student from Denmark in college, and when he first showed up to America, though, one of the things he had this line where he'd be like, "I have dark hair because my grandfather is Spanish," and it was just like for him, like in Denmark, that's very exotic.
Yeah.
Where people in America will be like, "Okay,
Sure.
you got 3 Danish grandparents and 1 Spanish grandparent. That's cool. I mean, why?" And, like, I pulled him aside, I'm like, "You know that people here, it's like, they're 4th Welsh, you
Right.
know, a 4th Italian,
Right.
half German, like, this is like, being a 4th Spanish and 3/4 Danish is not exotic here in the same
No.
way, and also a lot of people here do have dark hair.
Right. Yeah, you
I
can have dark
I
hair
don't
for the
it
reason.
was like he knew intellectually that it was kinda but he had this, like, reflex, like, this was his line,
Yeah.
and he would, like, tell people, I guess, in Denmark, and he just, like, initially did that. So, I think it is, true, like, America, we do have, like, all these, like, mixed types of people, and in a way, like, he's basically he is a white person with non-European ancestry, which is actually very common in Latinx America.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean
Yeah.
I mean, walking down the street, in Italy or in Spain or in even France, he would not no one would bat an eye, you
Right.
know?
Right.
I mean, he just looks like a Southern European guy. But yeah, he probably does have some African ancestry, whatever. Um, and he's American from Chicago. It's kind of like but I do have to say, like, Francis Papacy, like, he was Argentinian and Italian. It's kind of like a bridge, from Europe to the.
So Francis is a interesting case because he is Argentine, grew up in Argentina, but I believe all four of his grandparents were immigrants from Italy. So by ancestry, he's just 100% Italian, so he's not. In fact, I've joked at the time that this was a sneaky way for the Italians to recapture the papacy. They get an Italian as pope and they convince everybody that he's Latinx. Um, but so that's possible there, but that would be. I mean, it would be rare to find anyone who's 100% Italian American. Here, right? It just doesn't.
I mean, there are, in some urban areas, I think in
I'm
some
sure,
urban
sure,
areas
sure,
there's
sure.
still, yeah, that happens. But yeah, it's getting rare and rare. Part of the issue is, you know, just for like the non-Americans, after World War II, the white ethnics who were disproportionately they're Catholic basically, white Catholics
Yeah.
started intermarrying, and so you had Irish, Italian, German Catholics intermarrying extensively. I mean, obviously some French Canadians, but there are not that many of them. Mostly
Yeah.
Irish, German, and Italian really started intermarrying, and so you had this like new like generic white Catholic, you know, population. Now there are parts of the country, like parts of Wisconsin, that are like 80 to 90% German. So
Right.
there are still a fair number of people that are mostly German. The thing with Italian Americans are they're concentrated in the greater New York City area,
Yeah.
and they if it's like a very Italian area, it might be 50% Italian,
Right.
and the other 50% is gonna be, like, Irish and all sorts of white ethnics and black people. So, Italian Americans live in a context where they are not an overwhelming majority anywhere, really, and so that's why it's very common for there to be many people who are half Jewish, half Italian, a fourth Italian, three-fourths whatever, and it's just like it's like contact theory, contact hypothesis, right? So it's a very, very typical background that way. So I've been reading that the papacy has issues with its finances and these other things.
Hmm.
Um, you know, I mean, yeah, like they don't do traditional accounting, and it's
Well, they do
very they're
traditional
very
Italian accounting. They do traditional
yeah.
Italian. Yeah.
Yeah, which is like, not
Not not
they're not tracking the expenses and all that. I mean, there's a lot of, when you think about it, like the Roman Catholic Church or the papacy as a spiritual, idealistic institution, but it's a political institution. It's been a political institution. The Pope was the model for. I mean, I think, it was the Medici popes that were the model for the Machiavelli's prince, right? It was
pardon.
Medici popes, not the Borgias, right? So it's like, the Pope is a political actor, and the Curia is a political institution, and there's
Yep.
all these like real world problems that it's having to deal with. I think this is one of the reasons Pope Benedict, the German born Pope, left, early because he couldn't like deal with it. Yeah.
Yeah, this is so the Vatican finances have been kind of a big mess and a black hole for a long time. They actually kind of improved a little bit for a while. They were really bad. Uh, I think if you go back 100 years ago, right, and then
Mhm.
they improved somewhat, partially because of Mussolini when he regularized the status with the Vatican after used to be little history lesson, of course, as we know, used to be Rome, the Catholic Church was in charge of its own country, the Papal States, which was a significant part of Italy. And then in 1870, when Italy was unified, the Pope was kind of confined to the Vatican. And in the 1920s, under Mussolini, the Italian government kind of worked out a deal with the Vatican to, where they recognized a little bit of Vatican territory as independent, and the Vatican recognized Italy. And as part of that, the Italian government gave them like a lump sum payment, sort of as compensation for all the territory that was taken and other stuff, right? So that helped stabilize the finances for a while, and they started to get more professionalized. But really, it's not. There's a lot of issues. There's been associations with organized crime, the mafia, so on and so forth. Under Benedict and then also Francis, there were some attempts to kind of reform and regularize the financial system. Cardinal George Pell, who was Australian, was brought in to try and do that. He ended up being falsely accused of child abuse and went to prison for that for a while before he was released. And that kind of derailed those efforts. Another guy, Bishop Vigano, was in charge of the finances for a while, and he ended up kind of fleeing into hiding and accused Pope Francis of all sorts of misdeeds. Uh, So anyway, so it's a sticky wicket. It's a very it's a big mess, and maybe Pope Leo will decide he wants to take it on, and maybe he'll have some success with that. I don't know. One can only hope, but you're dealing, with the Italians. They're very good at, they may not be that great at traditional accounting practices or whatever, but they are very good at bureaucracy. They are very good at some of these like internal political games, right? They've read their Machiavelli, I guess. So it'll be a tough challenge to take on
Mhm.
if Pope Leo does that, and we'll see what comes of it.
All right. One thing I'm gonna say, is um, you know what? Um, now I forgot like what is it? So what is the sticky wicket? What is that? What is that?
Was this? I mean, I don't know. It's a wicket. I think is something in cricket. Is
So
that not
yeah,
right?
like what is it? I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't. No
You
one, no,
want
none
all
of,
right.
no, none of our audience, no one knows
All
cricket.
right. Well,
Okay, okay. Now we're speaking about cricket. Now we got to switch topics, though.
yeah. Well,
Two countries brought together by cricket have been
hold
pulled
on, hold on.
apart.
Before we get to that, let me just say first, I'm going to look up what sticky wicket means. But also, see, this is what I get. So I was going to say my instinct was going to say I was going to like make a reference to like you don't want to grab the tar baby or whatever, right? And I was like, maybe I shouldn't say that. And so
Nah, that's
Brand
not.
was like, well, what's a similar, something else? And so I went with Sticky Wicket. But then you, Razib, you called me out and we were like, well, what does that even mean? And all right, in cricket, a sticky wicket refers to a pitch that has become wet from rain and is drying out, causing the ball to bounce unpredictably and uneven. I don't know. So it's a cricket thing. I don't know anything about cricket either, but I guess it's a metaphor for being in a jam or a pickle or some sort of, sticky situation. So um, there you go.
Well,
But
I mean,
as you
so,
say, yeah, go ahead.
Indian subcontinent. Just like let's paywall this, but the Indian subcontinent is in a sticky
Let's
situation right
paywall it
now.
before I talked about the tar babies.
You want me to paywall that? Okay, yeah, yeah. So we'll paywall it before the tar babies part. Yeah, yeah. So, uh, yeah. I have been kind of paying attention to this out of the corner of my eye. It's kind of weird because what's it like? 1.7 billion people are now at war, kind of.
Yeah,
But like it's kind of like a phony war a little bit.
right.
Like that's what the context for this, just for the listeners who know, is I mean, to the best of anyone's knowledge, it seems like Pakistan's state has been using, what we call terrorism, um, via its intelligence services in particular, as an arm of state policy for decades, especially against India. Not just India, though. Famously, Osama bin Laden was in Pakistan for a decade,
Right. Yes.
and he was actually very close to a military base, so
Yes.
that was suspicious. So a lot of Americans suspect uh, Pakistan to be heavily involved in the kind of networks that eventually, blew up in America's faces, which is true. True. Pakistan was pro-Taliban, whereas India was anti-Taliban, pro-Northern Alliance, all this stuff. So what happened is that there was a tourist destination in Kashmir area, and basically some terrorists shot a bunch of Hindu men, and they were a lot of them were newlyweds. So yeah, optically that's not great. Um, and so India started like bombing sites in Pakistan, and it hasn't led to full out war. There's not like mass mobilization, but a few people have died. Including like one of Daniel Pearl's main kidnappers. They targeted him in an airstrike. So
Couldn't
that
have
was
happened to a nicer guy, I guess.
yeah, yeah. So one thing that seems to be is like the Chinese missiles are good. So
Yeah.
Pakistan. So one of the things that I think a lot of people, maybe I guess a lot of Americans don't know jack about anything abroad. Over the last 25 years, since 9/11, Pakistan has slowly shifted from being an American client, because during the Cold War, Pakistan was American proxy client,
Right.
to basically a Chinese proxy client,
Yeah.
right? And so they have these Chinese rockets. Back in the day, they would have had American rockets. But they
Right.
have these Chinese rockets, and the Chinese rockets are actually pretty good at shooting down these Russian planes that India is sending.
Yeah. Because
So
India was, I mean, not quite a Soviet proxy, but they were more aligned with the Soviets during the Cold War. And
yeah,
that even as Pakistan has